It was supposed to be an ordinary flight. A small, chartered plane carrying 7 passengers over the majestic Andes Mountains, nothing out of the ordinary. Yet, what began as an easy trip soon became a fight for survival that no one had ever expected. Sarah had spent years climbing mountains, scaling treacherous peaks and enduring the worst that nature had to offer. But nothing in her long list of experiences could prepare her for what she was about to face. Beside her sat John, a businessman who had no clue how much his life was about to change. He had been rushing through meetings and calls for weeks, trying to make it to his next venture in the remote heart of the Andes. Emily, a student with a love for adventure, had dreamed of a trip to these very mountains since she was young. Mike, a quiet farmer with a deep connection to the land, had come to the Andes for a family reunion. Greg, the seasoned pilot, was as calm as always, and Dr. Stevens, a retired doctor, and Mary, a mother in her late 40s traveling to visit her daughter, rounded out the group. They all boarded the plane without a second thought. The plane was small, but it seemed sturdy enough, with its quiet hum barely noticeable in the background. They settled into their seats, exchanging polite conversation and looking out at the snow-covered peaks below, oblivious to the disaster that was about to strike. It was a crisp winter morning when the storm began to build in the distance. At first, it was just a speck of cloud on the horizon, but soon, the sky darkened, and the turbulence began. A shudder ran through the plane as the winds started to pick up. Greg, who had been experienced in navigating through storms, remained calm. "No need to worry," he reassured the passengers. "It's just a little rough weather. We'll pass through it soon." But he was wrong. As the plane climbed higher, the storm intensified. The turbulence became unbearable, tossing the plane around like a leaf in the wind. Then, without warning, a lightning bolt struck the plane. The cabin lit up in a blinding flash, followed by a deafening crack. Everything happened in an instant, and yet time seemed to stretch. The plane began to drop. Panic spread like wildfire as the plane plummeted toward the jagged mountains below. Sarah's heart raced, her breath coming in shallow gasps as the ground grew closer. She could hear the frantic screams of her fellow passengers, but the roar of the wind drowned them out. The plane jerked violently, twisting in midair, and for a moment, everything went black. When Sarah opened her eyes, she found herself sprawled across the cold, hard ground. Her body ached, her head pounding with a relentless throb. She blinked several times, trying to adjust to the blinding sunlight and the confusion that surrounded her. The world was spinning, and she couldn't remember how she had gotten here. All she knew was that she had to move. Her instinct screamed at her to get up, to check if everyone else was okay. It took a few moments for her to gather herself. She could see the wreckage of the plane scattered around her in pieces, twisted metal, shattered windows, and luggage strewn across the snow-covered ground. Smoke billowed from the wreckage, the remnants of the once functional aircraft now burning in the wilderness. The scent of burning fuel mixed with the biting cold air, making it hard to breathe. Her ears rang, and for a moment, she was disoriented. But she had to stay focused. "Is everyone all right?" she shouted, her voice hoarse from the cold. Slowly, one by one, the survivors began to stir. Emily was the first to sit up, clutching her chest as if she had just woken from a nightmare. Mike groaned from the wreckage, his leg twisted awkwardly beneath him, but he was still conscious. Dr. Stevens was tending to himself, his hands shaking but steady as he checked for injuries. Greg was already on his feet, scanning the area for any signs of danger. They were all alive. That much was clear. But their immediate survival was in question. "We need to move," Sarah said, her voice calm but urgent. "We can't stay here. The storm is only going to get worse." Greg, still in his pilot mode, nodded. "We need to find shelter. We're in a bad spot." The group huddled together, attempting to gather their bearings as they assessed the wreckage. The snowstorm was rapidly advancing, and the mountains seemed to stretch on forever. In every direction, they were surrounded by nothing but snow and ice. As the hours passed, the temperature dropped. They quickly realized that they were in the heart of the Andes, in a place so remote that the chances of rescue seemed slim to none. The storm continued to rage, and the cold began to seep into their bones. Sarah led the group through the wreckage, her eyes scanning the area for any supplies they could salvage. They found a first aid kit, some emergency rations, and a couple of water bottles. But it was nowhere near enough to survive for long in such harsh conditions. "We're going to have to make do with what we have," Sarah said, her voice steady. "It's going to be a long journey ahead, but we'll make it." Dr. Stevens looked at the group, his face grim. "We'll need to keep moving," he said. "The longer we stay in one place, the harder it'll be for us to survive." Emily, still shivering from the cold, was holding on to Mike, who could barely stand. His leg injury was more severe than they realized, and it would only worsen as they moved. Despite this, the group had no choice but to press forward. They formed a single line, each person bracing themselves against the biting wind. The next few days were an endless blur of exhaustion, cold, and hunger. With each step, they knew their survival depended on their ability to keep moving, to find shelter, and to hold on to the sliver of hope that remained. They trekked through the snow, using the wreckage as a landmark to guide them. But the landscape was treacherous. The snow-covered ground gave way to steep cliffs, making the journey even more dangerous. The cold was unbearable, and every step seemed to drain their energy. But still, they pressed on. By the end of the third day, the group was barely functioning. Mike's leg had become infected, and the pain was unbearable. Emily had begun to slow down, her body struggling to cope with the cold. And Sarah was starting to feel the weight of the journey on her shoulders. She had led the group with strength and determination, but even she was beginning to doubt whether they could make it. Yet they didn't stop. They couldn't. With every step, they moved closer to survival. The cold was the first enemy they had to face. Each breath felt like ice, biting into their lungs. Each step forward was like dragging their bodies through a thick wall of snow. It wasn't just the physical toll, the constant numbness creeping into their fingertips, toes, and faces, but the mental strain that was beginning to break them down. They had no idea where they were going, or if they would even find shelter. The wreckage of the plane was far behind them, and ahead stretched nothing but an endless, white desert. Sarah could feel her legs weakening with each step. She was leading the group, her back hunched against the wind as she trudged through the deep snow. But the others were worse off. Mike, with his leg injury, was clearly struggling. His foot kept catching in the snow, and he groaned in pain every few steps. Emily was a step behind him, clutching her stomach as if it were the only thing holding her together. Dr. Stevens, though quiet and composed, had a look of weariness in his eyes. He was constantly checking the others, offering support when needed, but his own energy was quickly fading too. Greg was the only one who seemed somewhat unaffected by the conditions. As a seasoned pilot, he'd flown in worse weather, though this was far beyond any storm he'd ever encountered. He had always been the calm one, but the reality of their situation was beginning to hit him too. He tried not to show it, but his every glance over his shoulder, every glance at the others, was a silent admission that he, too, was starting to lose hope. "Keep moving!" Sarah shouted into the wind, turning back to make sure everyone was still on their feet. "We'll never make it if we don't keep going." Her words were lost in the howling wind, but the group pressed on, knowing she was right. There was no time to stop. No time to rest. Every minute spent standing still was another minute the storm could close in on them, burying them deeper in the mountains. Hours passed. The sun was now completely hidden behind thick, gray clouds, casting an eerie pall over the landscape. They had to keep pushing through the thick snow, and their bodies, stiff with cold, didn't want to cooperate anymore. But they couldn't stop. Not yet. Greg, who had been scouting ahead, suddenly stopped in his tracks and pointed to the left. "I think I see something," he called out, his voice carrying an edge of disbelief. Sarah's heart leaped, though she quickly forced herself to maintain composure. They couldn't afford to get their hopes up. "What is it?" "A shelter. Maybe a cave or something," he said, though he wasn't sure. It could be anything, but it was better than nothing. The group, exhausted and desperate, quickened their pace. The thought of some kind of refuge sent a burst of energy through them. Every step now felt more purposeful, even if it was only the faintest glimmer of hope. As they approached the area Greg had pointed out, Sarah's heart sank. It wasn't a cave at all. It was a small rock formation, nothing more than a few boulders piled together, barely large enough to provide any cover from the relentless wind. "It's better than nothing," Sarah muttered, even though she could feel the disappointment welling up inside her. They collapsed into the small shelter, huddling together for warmth. Mike, still clutching his leg, was barely able to move, and Emily was shivering uncontrollably. Sarah took the lead once more, her mind racing to come up with some kind of plan. They had to stay warm, they had to survive. Dr. Stevens, pulling from his years of experience as a doctor, quickly began assessing everyone's injuries. Mike's leg had started to show signs of infection, and Emily's body temperature had dropped dangerously low. "We need to wrap Mike's leg, and Emily needs to get warmed up," he said firmly. But there was a problem. They had no fire, and they had no more rations. They had a limited supply of water, but that would run out soon, too. They couldn't afford to lose time. They couldn't afford to wait for rescue, if anyone was even looking for them. "How long do you think we'll be stuck here?" Emily asked, her voice quiet but desperate. "I don't know," Sarah replied honestly. "But we're going to have to survive. One way or another." The hours passed in silence, broken only by the sound of the wind howling outside. They huddled together, keeping as much warmth as possible, their eyes occasionally meeting in shared understanding. They were all in this together, but the weight of the situation was heavy, and it wasn't long before each of them began to wonder if they would make it out alive. That night, the temperature dropped even further. The rock shelter, though offering some protection from the wind, did little to stave off the freezing cold. Mike, his injury worsening, was in constant pain, groaning softly every few moments. Sarah took the first watch, staying awake to keep an eye on the others and make sure the storm didn't worsen. The darkness felt suffocating, oppressive. The storm raged outside, louder now, like some great beast pounding on the walls of their temporary refuge. The light from their small emergency torch flickered weakly in the dark, casting long shadows across the snow. Every gust of wind that slammed into the rocks felt like a reminder of how fragile their survival was. After what felt like an eternity, Sarah could feel her own body beginning to betray her. The cold was seeping into her bones now, and the exhaustion was starting to weigh heavily on her mind. She could hear her heartbeat, slow and steady, but she also felt the sting of fear creeping in. What if they didn't make it out of this? What if they were stuck here forever, lost in the mountains, forgotten by the world? But she pushed those thoughts away. They couldn't afford to think like that. She had to stay strong, for Mike, for Emily, for the others. She couldn't let them see her falter. They needed to hold on. Every hour that passed meant they were one step closer to being found. They had to make it until then. The next morning, Sarah woke up to the dull light of a gray sky peeking through the rocks. She hadn't slept much, but the cold and the relentless winds kept her from feeling well rested. She rubbed her eyes, trying to clear the fog of sleep, but her body was heavy with exhaustion. She glanced around the shelter, seeing the others curled up tightly, trying to conserve warmth. Mike's face was pale, his leg wrapped with cloth, but his condition wasn't improving. Emily's shivering had subsided, but she still looked weak, her cheeks flushed with the signs of hypothermia. "We need to move," Sarah said quietly, her voice hoarse. Greg, who had taken the second watch during the night, nodded in agreement. "We can't stay here. The storm won't let up, and we're too exposed." He glanced over at Dr. Stevens, who was silently examining Mike's leg. "We need to find shelter or better conditions." Dr. Stevens looked up, his face grim. "Mike's leg is getting worse. If we don't get him some proper medical attention soon, we could be facing an infection. But if we stay here, we'll freeze to death before that happens." The urgency of their situation was becoming all too real. Sarah could feel it in the pit of her stomach. This wasn't just about surviving the cold anymore. It was about fighting for their lives step by painful step. And with every hour that passed, their chances of survival seemed to dwindle. They gathered their things quickly, though their supplies were minimal, and prepared to leave the shelter. Mike was barely able to stand, his leg barely supporting his weight. Emily was weak, but she pushed herself up, determined not to slow the others down. There was no time for hesitation. Every minute mattered. The wind was still howling when they stepped out from behind the rocks, the cold air slicing through their clothing like 1,000 knives. It was almost unbearable. The snow had stopped falling, but the storm had left a thick layer of ice and snow on the ground, making every step treacherous. The landscape looked desolate, a blank canvas of white that stretched endlessly before them. "We need to head downhill," Greg suggested, his eyes scanning the landscape. "If we can get to lower ground, there may be a chance of finding shelter. We might find something, a cabin, a village. Anything." Sarah nodded. "We don't have a choice." They began their descent, moving slowly to avoid slipping on the icy surface. Each step felt like a battle. Mike was struggling to keep up, his pain evident with every movement. Emily was walking alongside him, her arm around his waist to help him keep his balance. Dr. Stevens was keeping a careful eye on everyone, assessing the physical and mental toll the journey was taking on them. And Sarah, she had taken the lead, pushing herself forward, knowing that the others would rely on her strength and determination. The snow had begun to fall again, this time in a heavy, relentless downpour. The visibility was quickly becoming near zero, and Sarah could feel the weight of despair closing in. She tried to focus on the sound of her boots crunching through the snow, the rhythmic pattern offering some comfort in the chaos. But with every step, she could feel her energy draining. "This is getting worse," Greg said, his voice strained. He paused, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. "We need to make a decision. Either we find shelter, or we risk being caught out here in the open." They had reached a small rise in the terrain, and from the peak, they could see a vast stretch of snowy hills and mountains. But off in the distance, barely visible through the snow, there was something. It was small and dark against the white background, but Sarah's heart skipped a beat. It could be a building. It could be their salvation. "We're going there," Sarah said, her voice stronger than she felt. "Come on. It's our best shot." Greg nodded, and they started moving in the direction of the possible shelter. But with every step, the snow grew thicker, and the wind seemed to be coming at them from every angle. The cold was gnawing at them, turning their fingers and toes into numb blocks of ice. Mike stumbled, falling to his knees. Emily screamed as she tried to catch him, but it was clear he was losing consciousness. The infection in his leg was spreading, and it was becoming harder for him to keep his eyes open. "Mike!" Sarah shouted, dropping to his side. She pulled him up with every ounce of strength she had. "Mike, stay with us! Come on!" But he didn't respond. His body was starting to shut down from the cold, and his fever was rising. Emily was crying, clutching Mike's arm as though she could keep him from slipping away. "Greg, we need to move faster!" Sarah cried, panic creeping into her voice. Greg, whose resolve had never wavered before, now looked genuinely concerned. "He's not going to make it if we don't get him somewhere warm soon." Dr. Stevens quickly moved to assess Mike's condition, but it was clear that the severity of the situation was growing with every passing moment. "I think we're too late," Dr. Stevens said softly, his voice pained. "We can't save him unless we get him out of here." Sarah's heart sank. She could feel the weight of her decision crushing her chest. But there was no time to mourn. They had to keep moving, or they would all perish. As the group continued on, it became clear that the storm was not letting up. The snowstorm was now a blizzard, thick and furious, with visibility reduced to only a few feet. But in the distance, there was still hope. "Look!" Emily gasped, pointing through the snow. Through the white, a faint outline was beginning to appear. A shape. A cabin. The shelter they had been praying for. It wasn't much, but it was something. And it was their only chance. Sarah's heart pounded in her chest. "We're almost there," she said, trying to reassure them, though her voice was trembling. The storm howled around them as they staggered toward the cabin, but they were too far gone to notice. All they could focus on was the faint outline of shelter that might, just might, save their lives. The snow was falling heavier now, the blizzard unforgiving in its fury. Sarah's breath came in ragged gasps, her lungs burning as she pushed forward through the dense, icy fog. Every step felt like it might be her last, but there was no time to stop, no time to give in to the cold or the exhaustion. If they didn't make it to the cabin, there was no hope. She had to keep moving, for Mike, for Emily, for everyone. The cabin was close, but it might as well have been 1,000 miles away. She glanced behind her to see Greg and Dr. Stevens carrying Mike between them, his head lolling against Greg's chest, his body barely conscious. Emily stumbled beside them, her face pale but determined, her breath visible in the freezing air. The wind cut through their clothing like knives, freezing their skin in seconds. But they were almost there. "We're going to make it," Sarah muttered to herself, pushing forward with renewed determination. She wasn't going to let them die out here. Not like this. But then, just as they were within sight of the cabin, disaster struck. Mike's body went limp, slipping out of Greg's grip and collapsing into the snow. Emily screamed his name as she rushed to his side, her hand shaking as she checked his pulse. The color had drained from his face, and his breathing was shallow. "No, no, no!" Emily cried, panic gripping her. She looked up at Sarah, tears streaming down her face. He's not breathing, Sarah!" Sarah's heart dropped into her stomach. She rushed over to Mike's side, her hands trembling as she felt for his pulse. There was nothing. No sign of life. Mike was gone. It took a moment for the reality to set in. Her eyes blurred with tears, but she forced herself to focus. There was no time to mourn. There was still Emily, still Greg, still Dr. Stevens, and still the shelter they were so close to. If they didn't get inside soon, they would all die out here. "Emily, we have to go!" Sarah shouted, trying to pull her away from Mike's body. "We need to get to the cabin now. We don't have time." Emily's face crumpled, and for a moment, it seemed like she might collapse into grief. But then she wiped her tears, nodding silently. I know. Greg and Dr. Stevens were already starting to move again, their faces pale and set in grim determination. They didn't speak, just trudging forward through the storm, barely able to see a foot in front of them. As Sarah helped Emily to her feet, they made their way to the cabin, which was barely visible in the swirling snow. The wind screamed through the trees, rattling the branches and making it nearly impossible to hear anything. But somehow, they found their way, step by agonizing step. Each breath felt like it could be their last, but they kept going. There was no other choice. Finally, after what felt like hours of staggering through the snow and wind, Sarah spotted the dark silhouette of the cabin in front of them. The small, wooden structure stood resolute against the storm, its windows dark but intact. They had made it. With the last of their energy, they rushed toward the cabin's door. Greg reached for the handle and turned it, only to find it locked. The desperation on their faces was evident. If the cabin was locked, they were in even more trouble than they realized. "Try the window," Dr. Stevens said quickly, trying to keep the panic out of his voice. Greg rushed around to the back of the cabin, testing the windows one by one until he found one that was slightly cracked. He pushed it open, his hands numb and shaking from the cold, and crawled inside. The others followed, Sarah helping Emily through the window and pulling herself in last. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold, but it was shelter. It was a small wooden room, the floor covered in dust and debris, but there was a faint smell of firewood and old blankets. There was a small fireplace in the corner, the chimney soot blackened from years of use. "We're safe," Greg muttered, collapsing onto the floor in relief. But Sarah didn't feel safe. Not yet. She glanced around the room, her heart still racing. They were inside, but they were still far from out of danger. They had shelter, yes, but they had no food, no heat, and no medical supplies. Mike was dead, and the others were barely clinging to life. Sarah moved quickly to the fireplace, trying to figure out how to start a fire. She found some dried twigs and small logs in a corner, as well as an old matchbook on the mantel. With shaking hands, she struck a match and lit it, holding it close to the kindling until it began to catch. The fire was weak at first, but it slowly grew stronger, casting a flickering light across the room. "It's something," Sarah muttered, the warmth from the fire slowly beginning to thaw her frozen limbs. Greg and Dr. Stevens had moved to the corner, pulling out the few remaining supplies they had. It wasn't much, but they still had a small bottle of water, a few granola bars, and some makeshift bandages. It wasn't enough to sustain them for long, but it was better than nothing. Sarah sat by the fire, trying to calm herself. Her mind was reeling, trying to process everything that had happened. They had lost Mike, but they had made it to shelter. They weren't safe yet, but they had a chance to survive. As the hours passed, the storm raged outside, but inside the cabin, they huddled together for warmth. Dr. Stevens took the lead, checking on their injuries, wrapping Greg's frostbitten hands and Emily's frostbite-ridden feet. They didn't speak much, but the silence was comforting. They knew that they had survived the worst of it. But they also knew that the struggle wasn't over. They had made it to shelter, but now they had to make it out alive.